In the early hours of February 1st, 2021, the Myanmar military, known as the Tatmadaw, seized power of the country. The coup led to the ousting of democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi and brought Myanmar's decade-long experiment with democracy to a crashing halt. A mass uprising soon broke out across the country and prompted a campaign of civil disobedience against military rule. The security forces responded by launching a brutal crackdown against the protesters, turning some areas of the capital, Yangon, into battle zones. Ten years of freedom and semi-democratic rule have come to an abrupt end. But why did the army stage a coup and shatter the hopes and dreams of many of its citizens? Will the violence and protests on the streets bring an end to the military's stranglehold on power in the country? February 1st, 2021, the day when the democratically elected government of democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi was toppled by the country's powerful army known as the Tatmadaw in a military coup. Blood has again been spilt on the streets of Yangon in the wake of a brutal crackdown by the security forces. Yet thousands of protesters kept pouring back onto the streets in a bold display of defiance of the authorities' escalating use of force, turning several towns and cities into a war zone. But each day brings growing dissent, with neither side showing signs of relenting. 35-year-old Shu Nye has been on the streets protesting against the military junta nearly every single day. She was initially afraid to join in the protests for fear of being detained or shot at by the security forces. But soon she's able to overcome her anxiety, driven largely by her anger over the return of military dictatorship in the country.
February 4 ရက်နေ့ကျမှလမ်းပေါ်စထွက်ဖြစ်တာပေါ့အဲ့ကလေးကပဲခုထိတောက်လျှောက်ထွက်နေဖြစ်တာအဓိကတော့ကိုယ့်အတန်ကိုကြားစေချင်တာကိုလက်မခံဘူးဒါပြည်သူအတန်မဟုတ်ဘူးဆိုတာကိုဖော်ထုတ်နေချင်တာပေါ့နော်နိုင်ငံတော်တက်ဆိုတက်ကိုလည်းပါမကြည့်ပြည်သူတွေထွက်ပြီးဆန္ဒပြနေကြတာဆိုတဲ့အခါကျတော့နောက်ရက်ကျတော့ကိုလည်းကိုယ့်ရဲ့အတန်ကိုဖော်ထုတ်ချင်တဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်မလို့ပြီးတော့ကိုသားရဲ့အနာဂတ်ပေါ့နော်ခလေးက9နှစ်ဆိုတော့သူကအကြောင်းနေရမယ်အရွယ်ရောက်နေအဲ့ဒီမှာအကယ်၍ဒီအာနာသိန်းတဲ့ဟာကိုလက်ခံလိုက်တယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်သူ့ရဲ့ရှေ့ရေးပညာရေးအနာဂတ်အတွက်ကမကောင်းတော့ဘူးကွာအဲ့လိုမျိုးဆိုတော့အဲ့ဒီအတွက်ကိုသူကရအောင်အမှန်တရားကိုရအောင်ပြန်လုပ်ချင်တဲ့စိတ်နဲ့အဲ့လိုမျိုးပါပြခဲ့တာပေါ့ဟုတ်
But what really prompted the army to stage a coup and bring down a democratically elected government? Speculation was rife about an impending military coup since late January this year. On January 28, 2021, At a news conference, the military spokesman, Major General Zaw Min-tun, was asked if the military would stage a coup over its claim that the country's 2020 general elections were tainted by voter fraud. He declined to rule out that possibility. And that came barely 2 months later. Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, or NLD, won a landslide victory in the November 8th elections. The party secured 82% of all the 1,117 contested seats. The military-linked party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP, on the other hand, won only 71 seats, or 6.4% of the vote nationwide. The military's request for an investigation into election fraud was rejected by the Election Commission, reaffirming that voting was conducted in a fair and transparent manner. And all of a sudden, in the early hours of February 1st, 2021, the people of Myanmar woke up to the news that the military had seized control of the country. Key politicians and their deputies were detained, including democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi, leader of the National League for Democracy, or NLD, and the country's president, Win Myint. The junta also removed 24 ministers and deputies and named 11 replacements. Power was handed to Army Chief Min Aung Hlaing. The new government then imposed a curfew in the country while internet service was cut off.
UEC တူရဲ့တာဝန်တွေကိုဒါမထမ်းဆောင်နိုင်တဲ့အခြေအနေမျိုးမှာပေါ့နော်ဒါလိုရရလို့ပြောတယ်ဒီမှာကြည့်မယ်ဆိုရင်လေဒီရွေးကောက်ပွဲမတိုင်ခင်ကတည်းကနေပြီးတော့မှတက်မတော်ကအကျဉ်းချင်းပေါ့လေသတိပေးစာတွေထုတ်တာတွေရှိတယ် Union ဒီရွေးကောက်ပွဲတရားမျှတဖို့လိုပဲဆိုပြီးတော့မှထုတ်တာရှိတယ်ဒါအပြင်ရွေးကောက်ပွဲပြီးတဲ့ကာလမှာလည်းတက်မတော်အနေနဲ့ပေါ့လေဒီရွေးကောက်ပွဲမှာတမာမှုတွေဖြစ်နေဆိုတဲ့သတင်းတွေမူတည်ပြီးတော့မှ UEC ကိုဖြည့်ရှင်းပေးဖို့ဆိုပြီးတော့မှထပ်မံပြီးတော့စာတွေထုတ်ခဲ့တာရှိပါတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့လည်းတိကျတဲ့ရလဒ်အဖြေကိုရလဒ်ကို တိကျဖြည့်ရှင်းချက်ကိုမထုတ်ပေးနိုင်ဘူးပေါ့နော်
The NLD, however, feels that its victory in the election has nothing to do with voter fraud. Instead, it's an indication of a growing dissatisfaction over the power-sharing arrangement between the military and the civilian government.
နောက်ဆုံးကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီနေပြည်တော်မှာဒီ February 1 ရက်နေ့အာဏာသိမ်းမှုမဖြစ်ခင်တပတ်တော့လို့မှာသူတို့ရဲ့ရွေးကောက်ပွဲတက်မတော်ဟာသူနဲ့မဆိုင်တဲ့အလုပ်တွေဖြစ်တယ်ရွေးကောက်ပွဲဒီမဲစင်းကွာဟမှုဆိုတာယူသူကဒါလီဆယ်ပြီးတော့အမျိုးမျိုးချင်းချောက်တယ်နောက်ပြီးဆိုကျွန်တော်တရားမဝင်ပေါ့လေကျွန်တော်ပါတီလူကြီးတွေခေါင်းဆောင်ပေါ့နော်ဒေါ်အောင်ဆန်းစုကြည်နဲ့သူတောင်းဆိုတာကျွန်တော်ကြားတာဆိုရင်သူတမရရာလူကြီးတောင်းလာတယ်ဆိုတော့ဒီ constitution ပေါ့2008 constitution ကကျွန်တော်တို့ပေးထားချက်ကြီးကတမရသည်အာဏာရဲ့အခရာပဲဆိုတော့ပြည်သူလူထုက NLD ကိုတမရဖြစ်စေချင်လို့တခဲနဲ့မဲပေးခဲ့တာဖြစ်တယ်ဒီတောင်းဆိုချက်ကို NLD ကဘယ်တော့မှလိုက်လျောမှလည်းမဟုတ်လိုက်လျောလို့လည်းမရဘူးလေဆိုတော့ပြည်သူက NLD ကိုမဲပေးခဲ့တယ်ဆိုတာအဓိက NLD တမရရာတို့ယူပြီးတော့ဒီတိုင်းပြည်ကိုစီမံအုပ်ချုပ်ဖို့အတွက်ဒါမဲပေးတာ
NLD fail to understand that they fail to see the Tamaro as a partner in the democratization process so they see them as an obstacle and so they try to push aside the military from the political process and then create a lot of tension and ending with the February state of the emergency.
The response by the military following the state of emergency was swift. It arrested most of the National League for Democracy's politicians, including 70-year-old NLD secretary and Central Executive Committee member U Han Tha-min. According to his wife, Swepo Myint, her husband was at their family home in Yangon when the military personnel came for him.
On the 31st January night, he went to Yangon. He got some appointment with someone, so he slept there. And on the early morning, on Monday, the 1st February, which was also my birthday. Yes, I got up earlier than usual because it was my birthday, so I got up early to offer the morning session prayers and to offer sondor and to meditate. I got up earlier than before, so at about 4:30, I think, I got a call from my younger daughter stating that my husband was detained.
Sui Pon Min is a retired politician. She used to hold the rank of the Deputy Director at the Ministry of Industry. She says no one witnessed the arrest. But the next morning, a police officer showed up at the house to pick up some personal items belonging to her husband.
My biggest concern is of his health. He is taking a hormone therapy and he got CA prostate and he got a surgery last year. So every 3 months he had to take the injection. And prison is not the safe place for COVID also, besides that. So I'm very much concerned about his health. And he's over 70 and he will never get a care properly in prison.
Her husband was not the only NLD politician who got arrested. NLD leader Aung San Suu Kyi was also part of the first group of politicians who were detained, along with more than 2,000 people from the party.
Why did the military do this? Military can only answer. And everyone wants to know it, the answer of it. Why did they did it? I don't really understand. I'm still trying to understand like most other people in that.
Meanwhile, angry protesters have taken to the streets to demand for the restoration of democracy in the country. And soon the protests grew from a few hundred to thousands, spreading across the country.
So, Mama Bima, Agu Yazu Nekale, ID Nibinya, and a day show was done for the day show technology to call it, and set the Yazu Yawi. Kavamo Bese Anna Shema, Ramulu Miaro, Niam Shiva, Uladamaga to Mujokudane, dear one Jora. So, General did I worthy Tamane Adama.
The sheer number of people who came out to vent their anger at the military takeover surprised almost everyone. It was a matter of time before things took a turn for the worse.
So if you look back the situation, they practiced the maximum restraint for nearly 3 weeks. As after the situation was, now they try to use the force to disperse the protests.
A more lethal force has indeed been employed, including the use of live rounds against the protesters in a desperate attempt to crush the uprising. To date, more than 500 people have been killed during the violent crackdown. "23-year-old Sin Ma Nui, for one, could never have imagined that her marriage only lasted for 5 years. She was among those who protested against the military takeover, together with her husband, Hen Tut Ong, when tragedy struck unexpectedly right before her eyes.
I know that she and Mara Kang so in down the Gongo, Uni at the Bajan and Yamara Lanija. Kang and Arubakan and Lancha Island. I need our Yamaronia and Nogja. Nogja Rajam Mululi. ကိုယ့်ဘာသာကိုယ်ပေါ့နော်စုလေးမှာကောက်ပေါက်မယ်ဆိုပြီးတော့လိုင်းကစီးပါပေါ့ခိုင်းတော့4ယောက်သွားအခုကအဲ့နေ့ကကြောင့်တကယ်2ယောက်ကမလိုက်တော့ဘူးသူတို့အမေစုလို့ဆိုတော့ညီမတို့2ယောက်ပဲသွားလေတာဝိုင်းပြည့်စီးသွားတယ်ဝိုင်းပြည့်စီးသွားတော့ဆံမြဈေးနည်းနည်းကြော်လဲကြော်ပေါ့အရှိမလမ်းကြီးပိတ်ထားလို့ဆိုပြီးတော့ကားသမားညီမတို့ဆင်းခိုင်းတယ်ဆင်းလိုက်တာပေါ့ဆင်းပြီးတော့ညီမတို့ကအရှိမပြစ်တော့ပြစ်တယ်ကွာဟိုအရင်တော့မဟုတ်ဘူးပေါ့တင်မနည်းနည်းပါးပါးတော့ချင်းကြတာထိမှဆိုလို့ဆိုညီမတို့ဒီဘက်ကားလမ်းကနေဟိုဘက်ကားလမ်းကိုကူးပြီးတော့ကားဘေးနားလေးမှာခဏပေါ့နော်ရဲနေတာအဲ့အချိန်မှာပဲအပေါ်ကနေပေါ့ပြောမယ်ဆိုတော့အပေါ်ကနေပေါ့ပြစ်ခံလိုက်ရတာပေါ့အရှိတဲ့ရတော့မဟုတ်ဘူးဘာပြောလဲဆိုတော့လေအရှိတဲ့ရဘာလို့မဟုတ်ဘူးလဲဆိုတော့အရှိတဲ့ပြစ်နေတဲ့နေရာနဲ့ညီမတို့ကနည်းနည်းလေးလှမ်းနေလေအဲ့တော့လူကလည်းအဲ့နားမှာနည်းနည်းကများတော့အားကြောင့်အရှိတဲ့ရတော့ပြစ်လိုက်တာမဟုတ်အပေါ်ကနေလှမ်းပြီးတော့ပြစ်လိုက်တာပဲနော်ဟိုညာဘက်ရင်အောင်ဘက်ပေါ့နော်ထုတ်ချင်းပေါက်ပြီးတော့ပွင့်သွားအနောက်ကနေထိတာမဟုတ်အဲ့ရှေ့ကနေထိတာမှရှေ့ကနေပွင့်သွားတာမင်းမလေးနေရာလေးအကွာအဝေးဘယ်လောက်ရှိမကွာဘူးညီမတို့နှစ်ယောက်ကဘေးချင်းကက်ပေါ့နော်လက်တွဲထားတာဆိုဘေးချင်းကက်ဟိုနော်ဘာမှတော့ပြောမတော့ဘူးသူအဲ့မှာကြည်ချင်းပဲအားဆိုပြီးတော့អော်လိုက်တယ်អော်တော့ညီမကဘာဖြစ်သွားလဲပေါ့ဒီအဲ့လိုပြီးတော့တနက်စစ်ကြီးနဲ့ပြစ်တယ်တော့မထင်လိုက်ဘူးပေါ့ဒီအဲ့မှာဘာဖြစ်သွားဆိုကြည့်တော့လေရင်မက်ကိုတွေးထွက်လာတွေးထွက်ညီမအိုင်နာလူတွေအကူကြီးခေါ်ပြီးတော့တောင်းတာဘာမှတော့ညီမတို့ပြောမလို့သူ့ရဲ့သူတော်မှအန်ကြိတ်ထားပေါ့နားလို့တော့ညီမ
The army, also known as the Tatmadaw, is used to being in charge of the country. The only time when it had to cede some powers to a quasi-civilian government was in 2015, following the country's transition to democracy. That happened after the National League for Democracy, or NLD, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, won a landslide victory in the country's first free election in 2015. The party captured 390 of the 491 contested seats in both houses of parliament, or almost 80% of the elected constituencies. The military-backed party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP on the other hand, garnered only 41 seats, or 8.4% of the contested seats. The defeat was a bitter pill for the military to swallow. The military's pride was dealt a blow yet again when it suffered another humiliating defeat in the November 8, 2020 election. This time, the NLD won by a bigger majority of 83% of the contested seats. It then alleged widespread voter fraud and electoral irregularity for its massive loss.
ဒါပေမဲ့ live ကြည့်တဲ့အချိန်မှာတမန်တော်အဲ့အချိန်ကတော့ဇက်တိုက်ဒါထုတ်ပြန်တာရှိတယ်ဒီမြို့နယ်တွေလိုက်ပေါ့နော်မဲကွာဟမှုတွေပေါ့နော်အဲ့ဒီမှာဒါအသက်မပြေမှုတွေလည်းပါနေတယ်နောက်မှတ်ပုံတွေမရှိမှုတွေလည်းပါတယ်အထူးသဖြင့်ဒီအသက်100ကျော်တဲ့ဒါကပေါ့နော်ဘိုးဝါးတွေရဲ့ဟိုပါပေါ့နော်မဲပေးမှုကတိတ်ပြီးတော့မှမြို့နယ်တွေမှာအရေးအတွက်များပြားတယ်မြင်ရတယ်ပေါ့နော်ဒါဆိုဒါဖြစ်နိုင်မှာမလားဆိုရင်မိကုန်းတွေဖြစ်လာပါတယ်ပေါ့နော်ဆိုတော့ဒါဆိုရင်သူတို့ပြောတဲ့ဒီ election fraud ပေါ့နော်ဒီမဲအစင်းလိန်ခိုးမှုလားလိန်နယ်မှုတွေကတကယ်ဖြစ်မလားဆိုတော့မိကုန်းထုတ်စရာရှိလာပါတယ်
After the election fraud allegation was rejected by the Election Commission, the army then staged a coup on February 1st, 2021. The move has put an end to the power-sharing arrangement with the NLD. It has also brought the progress towards a new democratic era in Myanmar to an abrupt halt. The reality is, the military has never truly left the political scene, nor has it indicated its willingness to give up its power entirely. If anything, it's merely reasserting its command as the guardian of the nation, especially when its position is under threat.
Basically, the first one is Article 59F of the Constitution, which forbids the Aung San Suu Kyi presidency. So the NLD want to amend that, and the military doesn't agree on that issue. That's the one, the big major problem. The second is the NLD failed to recognize the military role in the Myanmar politics because according to the constitution, they had right to play the leading role in the politics. So the NLD cannot accept that. So I think these are the two major issues.
So through the Keran you got those level. Allow you to have it or Tabi Anna or allow take your point yani that ma. We each another Manyamal don't yata. No? Kawaii, necessary video, don't yata. Take it, Yeji post. General Tamara patches when you know pet up on a machine. Sissy on a machine. Edido chaining you the yata near you. And allow them maintain video. Anna 100% to Gina sing at Doma. Anna Yamu or Dana. Pa Jong Maho.
But why does the military insist on clinging on to power instead of handing it over to a civilian government? Myanmar has been ruled by a military junta for many of the years since it gained independence from British colonial rule in 1948. It was then known as the Union of Burma. But its independence was marred by continuous civil wars, with many ethnic minorities demanding greater autonomy from Yangon, then known as Rangoon. And that had threatened the stability and security of the newly independent state.
The communists, as well as many ethnic groups who saw themselves as maybe having a different future than the main nationalist Burmese groups, went into rebellion. And that civil war, frankly, has been continuing on even up to today. You could basically argue that right now Myanmar is still fighting that very same civil war that started in 1945.
The continuing civil wars provided enough grounds for the military to step in. On March 2nd, 1962, the military staged a bloodless coup led by its military leader, General Ne Win. Myanmar's parliamentary democracy under its first prime minister, U Nu, suddenly came to a screeching halt. Ne Win abolished the 1947 constitution, dissolved parliament, and sent most of the civilian politicians to jail. His reason for staging the coup: to stop a possible disintegration of the Union of Burma and turn the country into a truly socialist state.
Because the military think they are the guardian of the nation. So they have this strong reason to believe that, because since 1948, the Myanmar have a lot of the armed conflict and a lot of political crisis. Every time the military play the directly or indirectly important role in all these processes or all these crises. So that's why they think they are the guardian of the nation.
The coup, however, marked the end of a democratic form of government. It also ushered in the beginning of 4 decades of direct military rule over the country. For the next 50 years, the military stayed in power almost continuously, claiming that it was the only institution capable of holding the country together. Decades of diplomatic isolation by the West, however, dealt a severe blow to its economy. In 1962, Burma was one of Asia's richest countries. But decades later, it was one of the region's poorest.
It was led by Ne Win, who was the senior general, and they were able to, and they instituted socialist principles that meant a command economy that would nationalize industries and nationalize businesses and so forth, which meant foreign business and personnel ended up leaving the country. So there was a brain drain.
Privatization socialist LDC, least developing country. No?
Against the backdrop of a stagnating economy, people began to take to the streets in August 1988. The protest culminated in the 1988 uprising known as the August 8, 8888 uprising. The movement, started by students, grew to hundreds of thousands of protesters across the country. Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of Aung San, known as the father of the nation, emerged as a leading voice of the protest movement. But the protesters were met by a ruthless response by the Tatmadaw. 350 people died during the army crackdown, based on the official figures. But according to the human rights groups, the number of deaths was in the thousands.
Now, the uprisings were confronted with by the security forces, by military police, by local police, and by the army. And the army has always, even back to colonial times, seen as being a force to be used for internal security and also security to protect the nation from external ones. And they were used, and people say perhaps thousands of students, civil servants, and ordinary citizens were either shot, killed, in prison. Many others fled to the borderland areas, to Thailand.
62-year-old U Eng Taka was in his early 30s when the bloody crackdown took place. He was among a group of protesters known as the Young Monks, who were calling for an end to military rule. He was then arrested by the security forces for being a political monk and had to spend 7 years behind bars. In the aftermath, the Tatmadaw once again regained control of the state. Aung San Suu Kyi was placed under house arrest, and she remained there for a total of 15 years. But then, another mass protest movement began in September 2007, sparked by a widespread anger over a steep jump in fuel prices. It was dubbed the Saffron Revolution. It was named after saffron-colored robes widely used by Buddhist monks during their demonstrations. The military crackdown that followed left 13 people dead, according to official figures, while hundreds of others were injured. U Eng Taka was among those who were arrested and had to serve another 4.5 years in prison. It was only in May 1990 that a multi-party election was called. The surprisingly free and fair elections in Burma resulted in a resounding win for the opposition NLD. The party secured 60% of the popular vote and 80% of the parliamentary seats. But the military government refused to honor the outcome of the polls. It then arrested and imprisoned dozens of opposition parliamentarians.
Again, Suzuwa Sabi, Chausanet, no? Chausanet. Video, Tangua, Shisashi, no? Tangua was a Yugo Anadi 9, and I'm no Agono Tongatele, a group of Tongayago.
The military had to intervene on several occasions in Myanmar's history to re-establish political order in the country. But in doing so, it had gone against a rising tide of democratic sentiment among the people who had to endure decades of living under military rule. Will change finally arrive? For nearly 50 years, from 1962 until 2011, the military regime kept Myanmar isolated from the outside world. The country was also subjected to various forms of economic sanctions by the West due to the continued house arrest of Aung San Suu Kyi and its brutal crackdowns on protesters. It was only in 2010 that the regime signalled a change of its isolationist policy, holding fast to its commitment to implement the 7-step roadmap to democracy first announced in 2003.
So when they announced in 2003 that they were going to follow this roadmap to democracy, people were very skeptical, both within the country and without the country. They said, well, these military folks are not going to be very interested in establishing democracy at all. And so this is why it was very surprising when there was moves to develop a constitutional convention, to write a constitution that would be the charter, the blueprint for the future of the country. So they launched the roadmap to democracy and said that they're going to establish a constitution, hold general elections, and allow the winners to form government and so forth.
In 2008, the Tatmadaw drafted a new constitution it claimed would usher in a new era of disciplined, flourishing, genuine, multi-party democracy. Critics, however, argued that the 2008 constitution was designed to ensure the military's continued dominance in politics. According to the charter, the military would retain 25% of the unelected army representatives in parliament, giving it a veto over any move to change the constitution. It also had control over the country's security organs, including defense, home affairs, and border affairs.
အဲ့တော့ဒီ2008အခြေခံဥပဒေကြီးဟာတက်မတော်25ရာခိုင်နှုန်းဟဲ့လား automatically သူတို့ရပြီသားတကယ်တမ်းပြောအဲ့25ရာခိုင်နှုန်းဆိုတာ constituency အားလုံးပေါ်မှာရတဲ့25ရာခိုင်နှုန်းတကယ်တမ်းပြောရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကရွေးကောက်ပွဲလုံခြုံရေးချိန်ကြီးကမလုံနိုင်ခဲ့တဲ့ပြည်နယ်တိုင်းကြီးရှိပါရှမ်းမှာဆိုတဲ့အများကြီးရှိတယ်အခုရခိုင်ဒေသတွေရှိတယ်အခြားပြည်နယ်တိုင်းချို့ကရင်မှာလည်းတချို့ဒေသရှိတယ်အဲ့ပေါ်မှာအခြေခံပြီးတော့တွက်ပြီးဆိုရင်ကျွန်တော်25မက30လောက်ရတာနော်ကျွန်တော်တို့က25ရာခိုင်နှုန်း solid ယူထားတာဒီ constituency ပေါ်မှာ total constituency ပေါ်မှာ solid ယူထားတာတကယ်ကြောင့်အဲ့ခုနကတကယ်25ရာခိုင်နှုန်းတကယ်ယူသင့်တာကမဲမကျင်းပနိုင်တဲ့ area တွေကိုနှုတ်ပြီးမှ25ရာခိုင်နှုန်းယူတာမဟုတ်ကျင်းပသည်ဖြစ်စေမကျင်းတာအဲ့ total ပေါ်ရဲ့25ရာခိုင်နှုန်းဥပမာ
Here you had a system that was actually being established by the military from the top. This confounded a lot of people's expectations. And so what we saw was the military actually establishing a system similar to what they did before in 62. Although then they were establishing a system using socialist principles, this time they were establishing a system using liberal democratic principles and institutions.
It also enacted a law that prevented Aung San Suu Kyi from taking office of the presidency. According to the charter, anyone with a foreign spouse or children cannot hold the executive office. Despite these limitations, then President Thein Sein was able to introduce a series of political reforms. Among them, granting amnesty to political prisoners, relaxing media censorship, and implementing economic policies to encourage foreign investment. In November 2010, Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest after 15 years. And then, in 2011, power was transferred to a nominally civilian rule under the leadership of President Thein Sein, ushering in the end of direct military rule. In 2015, Myanmar held its first multi-party elections, considered to be the freest, open and fairest elections in decades. The election was won by the NLD by a landslide. The party led by Aung San Suu Kyi captured the majority of both the lower and upper house of parliament.
And so when the 2015 elections came along, people were questioning, will the military hand over power if a different group wins? And when Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD party won, power transferred, and people were very surprised about that.
Despite the setbacks, the military was still committed to taking slow steps towards democracy. But the NLD's move to change certain provisions of the constitution has put itself on a collision course with the powerful military.
Our President Thein Sein hope the NLD and Tamro can working together for the next step of democratization process, but unfortunately it doesn't happen. I think basically the first one is Article 59F of the Constitution, which forbids the Daw Aung San Suu Kyi presidency. So the NLD want to amend that, and the military doesn't agree on that issue.
The NLD also pushed for a constitutional amendment that would have reduced the number of seats reserved for the army from the current 25% to 10% after 2025, another 5% after 2030, and eventually getting rid of all of them altogether in 2035. That would also mean that the military would lose its veto over constitutional changes. But the move was blocked by the army.
So now that we create the political space, if the civilian politician and the military can work together and build the trust among themselves. But the problem is, for the civilian politicians, they cannot accept that because it's not up to the democratic principle. So they saw them as a military as a power-hungry institution and try to manipulate the politics under the 2008 Constitution.
ဒါပေမဲ့ကျွန်တော်တို့ဘက်ကတော့ကြိုးစားခဲ့တယ်ပြည်သူပြည်တဲ့ဂရီတိုင်းပဲကျွန်တော်တို့ကြိုးစားခဲ့တယ်ထောက်ခံမှုလည်းရပါတယ်သို့တော်လည်းပဲကျွန်တော်တို့ပြင်ခွင့်တော့မရပါဆိုတော့တပ်မတော်ကလွတ်တော်ထဲမှာလာထိုင်နေတာတကယ်တမ်းကျတော့ဘာမှမသက်ဆိုင်တဲ့အလုပ်ပါဒါကိုပြည်သူလည်းမြင်တယ်တပ်မတော်သားတကယ်နိုင်ငံရေးနားလဲလူတွေတကယ်တပ်မတော်သားဘဝကိုတကယ်မြင်လို့တဲ့လူကနိုင်ငံရေးမှာပေါအောင်သူက professional army standard army ပဲသူကလုပ်ချင်တာတပ်မတော်ကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ကလွတ်တော်တွေကဖယ်ရှားချင်တယ်ဆိုတာတပ်မတော်ရဲ့အခမ်းကဏ္ဍနိုင်ငံရေးအခမ်းကဏ္ဍနဲ့မဆိုင်ဘူးတပ်မတော်က
မဟုတ်ဘူးဆိုရင်ဒီ democracy စနစ်ကကူးပြောင်းလဲကာလမှာကျွန်တော်ကရှေ့ကိုခိုင်မာဖို့ဆိုရင်ပေါ့နော်စနစ်ကြအစဉ်စဉ်သွားမှာပေါ့ဆိုလဲအေဂျင့်စွာဆန္ဒထုတ်ဖော်ဖို့တင်တယ်လို့မြင်ပါတယ်အခုကျွန်တော်တို့ကြုံတွေ့နေရတာကတော့ဆန္ဒပြတဲ့သူတို့ရဲ့မိမိရဲ့သဘောထုတ်ဖော်ပြီးဆန္ဒပြတဲ့လူတွေရှိပြီမဲ့မိမိရဲ့လုပ်ငန်းဆောင်တာပုံမှန်လုပ်ပြီးတော့မှာပေါ့နော်လုပ်ချင်တဲ့လူတွေရှိတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာအဓိကအပြင်သွားလာမှုပေါ့နော်ပို့ဆောင်ဆက်သွယ်လမ်းကြောင်းတွေပွင့်နေဖို့လဲလိုအပ်တယ်မြင်ပါအဲ့မှာဆိုရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့မြင်တာကတော့ဒီလမ်းသွားတဲ့ဒီကားလမ်းတွေပွင့်နေဖို့လိုတယ်နောက်တစ်ခုကကျတော့အဲ့မှာဘာလို့လိုလဲဆိုရင်တခြားအရာတွေကပြဿနာမရှိပေမဲ့ကျန်းမာရေးအရေးပေါ်အခြေအနေ medical emergency ဖြစ်လာပြီဆိုရင်ဆေးရုံဆေးခန်းတွေအမြန်ရောက်ဖို့လိုပါတယ်ဒီမှာလမ်းတွေပိတ်ဆို့မှုဖြစ်လာမယ်ဆိုရင်ဒီခံစားမှာတော့ဓာတ်ရိုက်ခံစားမှာပြည်သူတွေပဲဖြစ်တယ်ပေါ့နော်ဒီတစ်ချက်ဖြစ်ပါတယ်နောက်တစ်ခုကတော့ပိတ်ထားတဲ့
Trust between the civilian government and the powerful military eventually broke down, and the relationship reached a point of no return. The military felt betrayed by NLD's desire to get rid of the military's power and influence in politics. The civilian government, on the other hand, simply wanted to live up to its true ideals of democracy. But following the latest power grab on February 1st, 2021, will democracy ever survive and prevail in Myanmar again? Myanmar is in turmoil. Its 10-year experiment with democracy has now come to a premature end. And the country is back in the clutches of the military. The fate of Myanmar's democracy icon, Aung San Suu Kyi, hangs in the balance. The Nobel Peace Prize laureate spent at least 15 years under house arrest before her release in 2010. Today, she has found herself at the mercy of the military regime yet again. More than 500 people have been killed amid the wave of protests against the military junta. Yet the civil disobedience campaign continues unabated, while fears mount over the return to the dark days of oppressive military rule in the country. Musician Cao Myato is known by people in the music industry as Float Rose. The 24-year-old has written numerous songs which touched on the nation's culture, politics and religion. But this time, the message is a lot stronger. Float Rose condemns the military takeover in no uncertain terms. And he's also among those who've been actively involved in the anti-military demonstrations. Through his songs, he wants to send a very strong and clear message to the military that what it did on February the 1st goes against the spirit of democracy and freedom, values which the people in Myanmar hold very close to their hearts. That same sentiment is also echoed by thousands of other protesters who've taken to the streets to demand the return of civilian rule in the country. Shu Nye, for one, feels that for the past 10 years, the people in Myanmar had lived in relative freedom. But now she rues the day when the army came and took it away from them, leaving the fate and future of the country in the hands of the military generals yet again.
For the military, they saw the civilian politician is they never understand the security issue. These politicians are more emphasized on the party politics over the national interest. So there's basically a lot of mistrust between the two sides.
But for the protesters, that trust was broken the moment the military seized power on February the 1st, 2021. And the time has now come for the military junta to give back power to the people. That is also how 24-year-old Sinma Nue feels. The death of her husband at the hands of the security forces has spurred her to fight on and stay the course. All she wants to see is for justice to prevail and for democracy to return to the country, just like her late husband had wanted.
မတရားလုပ်တာကိုမကြိုက်တော့အားကြောင့်မလို့ညီမတို့နှစ်ယောက်ကတော့စိတ်တူကိုယ်တူပဲအမြဲတမ်းအဲ့လိုပဲတောပြီးတော့လေအလုပ်ပိတ်တဲ့ခါတိုင်းတော့ဆန္ဒတော့ပြပြတာဟိုအရင်တော့ကတော့ဒီအိမ်မျိုးအမြင့်ပြုတ်ရှင်တာအမှန်ပဲဒါပေမဲ့အခုကတော့သူတို့မပြုတ်အောင်တော့တော်လန်ရမယ်ဆိုရဲပေါ့နော်အားတော့ပိုရှိသွားတာပေါ့ဒါပေမဲ့တော့သူမရှိတော့တဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်မလို့နည်းနည်းတော့ဝမ်းနေတာပေါ့ညီမတို့ခိုင်းလို့ရင်အတူတူကနှစ်ယောက်အတူတူသွားဆိုတော့အားကြောင့်ဟိုနိုင်ငံတွေကတော့ဆန္ဒပြနေတဲ့လူတွေကိုပေါ့နော်အားမလျှော့ပါနဲ့လို့ဆက်ပြီးတော့ကြိုးစားပါဒါပေမဲ့အန်ဒီရတော့ကြည့်ကြပါပေါ့နော်သူတို့ကအဲ့လိုမျိုးမကောင်းတဲ့အကျင့်တွေရှိတော့လေအားမလျှော့ပါနဲ့လို့နိုင်ငံခြားလူတွေကိုလည်းအားမလျှော့ပါနဲ့လို့ထပ်ပြီးတော့ညီမတို့တိုက်ပွဲဝင်ပြီးပါလေ
The question is there hope for true democracy to return to Myanmar? Will the military return power back to the people? The reality is, the Tatmadaw sees itself as the guardian of the nation. It's the one that keeps the country from disintegrating, an institution that stands above all the rest, including political parties. By keeping such a morally superior position, it'll be hard to imagine how the military will completely withdraw from the political scene in Myanmar.
NLD fail to understand that. They fail to see the Tamaro as a partner in the democratization process. So they see them as an obstacle. And so they try to push aside the military from the political process and then create a lot of tension and ending with the February state of the emergency.
အဲ့တော့တက်မတော်ကလုပ်တင်တာတစ်ခုပဲရှိတယ်မှားပါတယ်လို့ပြည်သူတောင်းမှကိုယ့်ရဲ့စစ်တမ်းလေးပြန်ဒီရွေးကောက်ပွဲအနိုင်ရတဲ့အစိုးရကိုအာဏာပြန်လွှဲပြီးအဲ့ဒါဆိုတိုင်းပြည်လည်းကောင်းသွားမယ်သူတို့လည်းကောင်းမယ်ဖက်ဖက်ကကောင်းသွားမယ်
10 years ago, there was hope. Today, that flicker of light has fast disappeared. The truth is, the military has never lost control of the state. The NLD's efforts to wrest power from the Tatmadaw has prompted the military to strike back and stage a coup. And with the future of Aung San Suu Kyi becoming increasingly uncertain, Myanmar's fragile push for democracy is set to face numerous obstacles. Hopes for future democracy no longer rest with her, especially with a string of criminal charges hanging over her head. For now, the military appears to have the upper hand in charting the course of the country's future, while the fight to restore democracy continues to its bitter end.